resources. I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer, founder and director of the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. Mary Jo will be facilitating the Q&A segment and will also share some more information about our presenter, Andrew Williams.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing, a well-being series. I'm Mary Jo Kreitzer, the founder and director of the center. For more than 25 years, we've been advancing the health and well-being in people, organizations, and communities. We are delighted to be hosting our well-being series speaker today, Dr. Andrew Williams, who will share his presentation, AfroSoul, Dreams of Freedom, Racial Reconciliation, and Healing Justice. At the Bakken Center, we know that many people, especially those from marginalized populations, experience significant barriers to well-being. Some of our past well-being lecturers, including Nicole Cardoza, Celeste Headley, and Dr. Rhonda McGee, have shared why one cannot fully experience or advocate for well-being without understanding the impacts that racism creates. The center is deeply committed to the well-being of the community, and as such, we will continue to ensure that equity, diversity, and inclusion is at the forefront of our work, not just in this well-being series, but in our curriculum, research, administration, philanthropy, communications, and more. Since our foundation, the center has been committed to providing free and low-cost resources like our Taking Charge of Your Health and Wellbeing website and our wellbeing webinars to everyone in the community. Today's free lecture is made possible through the generosity of our university and community sponsors. Thank you for your commitment to the health and well-being of people in Minnesota and around the world. Dr. Andrew Williams is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director at Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation. For more than 25 years, he has worked at the intersections of cultural anthropology, educational equity leadership, community-based learning, and global education. His research and teaching is focused on the cultural politics of Blackness within the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. His community-based work and activism has included projects on racial justice, climate change, environmental justice, food security, and health equity. Prior to his role at Hazelton Betty Ford, Dr. Williams was the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Success at the University of Minnesota, Rochester. We're just delighted to have you with us today, Dr. Williams. Please join me all in welcoming him.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Mary Jo, for your very generous introduction and for this invitation to be part of the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing Wellbeing series. I'm just really delighted to be here, and again, appreciate your very generous introduction, and so happy that so many of you could join us for today's Wellbeing series. I just want to check in with Mary Jo and Molly to make sure everything is okay and you all can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yep,
all right.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank you all very much. Well, I envision my talk today entitled AfroSoul, Dreams of Freedom, Racial Reconciliation, and Healing Justice. It's really part of a lifelong commitment that I've had to inspire healing, learning, and liberatory struggle. In some ways, I envision today's talk as part of a lifelong journey of engaging in sort of a revolutionary and evolutionary praxis that really centers on human rights, justice, and planetary health. Importantly, I come today as a storyteller, a cultural worker, and really not as an academic. What I'd like to do is share some stories from my personal and family life, professional experiences, and as well as my political engagement that I hope will illuminate the shifting cultural and political meanings of Blackness in the early 21st century, as well as perhaps illuminate some alternative pathways to Black liberation, racial reconciliation in our society, and healing justice. Now, the stories I want to share today are stories of audacious hope and radical love. of both seismic and subterranean resistance. Several of these are stories of migration, sometimes forced, coerced, and some cautiously voluntary. I mean, all of these stories, importantly, are very central to my sense of identity as a Black man who feels like he belongs to a subjugated people, whose oppression appears to be and seems to be, feels to be deepening rather than disappearing. But I believe a point that deserves special emphasis is that I do not see myself as a victim. Neither are these stories of victimhood, and nor are these stories of the cruelty of Europeans and white oppressors. These are instead heroic stories, stories of resilience, courage, resourcefulness, creativity, and solidarity from a soulful people who have survived despite the hurricane-force devastation brought by almost 400 years of racialized capitalism. These are stories of Black survivors. Let me begin with a little bit of my own personal story. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. Excuse me, and my mother gave birth to me when she was just 17 years old. As a result, my grandparents, Elise and Raymond, who had carved out a solid middle-class standard of living, lovingly stepped up to play a more significant parenting role in my life. My grandfather, Raymond, had been part of the great migrations of Black folks from the South to the North in the early 20th century. And he landed his first job in Indianapolis at the American Foundry as a late teenager, before becoming a small business owner who at different times owned a drugstore, apartment buildings, and eventually the most popular nightclub in the city's historic Black business and entertainment district along Indiana Avenue. As a child, or as a young person growing up, I heard that just about every jazz musician going east, west, north, or south would come to Indiana Avenue, to my grandfather's club to jam, including Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, and Duke Ellington. My grandmother was actually from Indianapolis, and she took on all the kin work of sustaining our household, doing all the cooking and cleaning and raising the children. She was also my grandfather's accountant and reader. My grandfather remained functionally illiterate for his entire life. Both my grandparents were active in the local NAACP, as well as Black social clubs, such as the 14 Lambs, but neither was involved in any really significant way at the larger civil rights movement taking place in our country in the mid-60s. Now, whereas my grandfather was a longtime member of the local AME church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and prayed on his knees every night, my grandmother was a Black Catholic who rarely attended church, but our home was filled with Catholic imagery, including a huge crucified Jesus that we had to pass in order to get back to the back part of the house where our bedrooms were. Now, this family context led me to be a perpetual border crosser as a young person. I moved in and out of Black churches and Black nightclubs. I moved in and out of African-American beauty shops and barber shops, Black country clubs for the rising Black middle class, and low-income apartments where my grandfather worked and operated his businesses. On a daily basis, I navigated not only the beautiful diversity of the African-American community, but also distinct Jewish and white middle-class Protestant communities in Indiana. Within a square-mile radius of my home were 3 distinct Jewish synagogues and a very large Jewish community center. I really wish I had a picture to show you of me at one of my best friend's bar mitzvahs with this yarmulke bobby pin to my big 1970s afro. But suffice it to say that the synagogues and the Jewish community center were a very important part of my socialization as a young person. Now, just the layer beneath this relative intercultural harmony that I experienced in North Indianapolis, underneath this layer of Black love and laughter, idyllic neighborhoods, and some level of economic vibrancy, there were largely invisible wounds of trauma, both proximate and transgenerational. Among my most vivid childhood memories are the annual Labor Day trips I would take with my grandfather to visit my great-grandmother and other kinfolk in Pulaski, Tennessee, where my grandfather was from. Now, Pulaski is a small rural town along the Tennessee-Alabama border. And I didn't know it at the time, but it's also the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. On one of these trips when I was about 12 or 13 years old, my grandfather took me on an unforgettable walk. After a really lovely kind of country breakfast, he said, "Hey boy, come with me. We need to go on a walk. I want to show you something." And we walked down this long, dusty road and finally arrived at a tree that provided us a little relief, a little shade and relief from the hot sun. And he said, "Andrew, right here at this tree, right here is the lynching tree where my father was murdered by the Klan. That means that my great-grandfather was one of the 6,000 African-American men, women, and children lynched between emancipation and 1950. In this epidemic of ritualized lynchings that often were accompanied by crowds in the hundreds, these ritualized lynchings of Black men and women and children were straight up racial terrorism designed to reinforce the political, economic, and social boundaries of white supremacy that had been destabilized by emancipation and Reconstruction. Now, over time, I heard more stories from my grandfather of crosses burning on hilltops and backbreaking work behind the mule plow. And as I heard these stories, I came to understand more fully the terror and toil that led my grandfather and many millions of other African Americans to make their way to the North as part of the Great Migrations. Little did my grandfather know, though, that the Klan actually beat him to Indiana. The Indiana Ku Klux Klan boasted 250,000 members at the height of its mainstream popularity in the 1920s. The 1920s membership roll included the governor, the mayor of Indianapolis, and over half the elected members in the Indiana General Assembly, and many other high-ranking state officials. Now, many in North Indianapolis, where I grew up in that community, were very familiar with the dangers of ethnic hatred. The first tattoos I saw in my life were not some of the beautiful sort of tattoos we see on so many people today, but the first tattoos I saw in my life were those on the arms of Holocaust survivors who became my eventual neighbors and first soccer coaches. I can still remember very clearly the day I went to my mother and asked, why does our neighbor, Mr. Frankovitz, have a serial number on his arm? My youth soccer coach, who you see here on the screen in the slide, was one of the few survivors of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Germany. When he wasn't coaching or refereeing soccer, he dedicated his life to discussing how prejudice, intolerance, and violence that characterized the Holocaust provides us with very powerful lessons today. And one of my professional highs was when I was a young faculty member at DePauw University back in Greencastle, Indiana, where I was teaching cultural anthropology and Black studies. I learned from our president's office that Mr. Vogel is going to be receiving an honorary degree from our university for his sustained work, right, to work against ethnic hatred, to teach about the dangers, again, of ethnic violence and intolerance. I was called by a president's office and said, they let me know that Mr. Vogel was receiving this degree and that he had called and wanted to make sure that I had a chance to sit at his table for the dinner celebration that happened the night before commencement. It was so wonderful to have this chance to reconnect with him and then see the ways in which our professional pathways, our sense of purpose, right, had really intersected. But we never had these sort of conversations, right, as I was a young boy playing soccer for him. He left me with a video that you see here on the screen as well. It's entitled, "If You Cried, You Died," and it documents his story and that of David Mandel as they revisited Auschwitz. The cover includes this important quote: "We must learn from the past to protect our future." Like my grandfather, George Floyd migrated to the North looking for a better quality of life and improved life chances. Like my great-grandfather, George Floyd was lynched, even though there was no lynching tree. Like so many lynchings, it was an agonizing and slow-motion murder in broad daylight. And almost 100 years after the lynching of my great-grandfather, I found myself deliberating whether or not I should take my then 9-year-old daughter to the site, just a few miles away from our home in South Minneapolis, where George Floyd's life was crushed by a police officer's knee, concrete pavement, and anti-Blackness. Like so many others, I was forced to grapple with how I might intensify my own efforts, right, to protect Black futures, to protect Black men like my 25-year-old son, Adrian, to protect Black women like Breonna Taylor, and to protect Black children like Tamir Rice, when it sometimes feels like it's really open season on Negroes. James Baldwin has written that history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. I think this insight has perhaps never been more apparent, right, to any of us than over the last 19 months of our lives. I think we can see our nation's history of state-sanctioned, racialized violence echoing in the unwarranted police killing of the unarmed George Floyd, and then the subsequent violent repression of racial justice protests that it sparked. I think we feel the historical aftershocks of medical and economic apartheid and the disproportionate rates of COVID infections and deaths among African American, Latinx, and Native Indigenous communities. I think if one knows how to read all the symbols that were on display during the January 6th assault on Congress, the assault on our democracy, we can also see the reflection of our nation's history as a colonial settler society, violently founded on genocide, slavery, white supremacy, racial terrorism, and Christian nationalism. Now, the convergence of the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, right? Convergence of that with the COVID-19 pandemic really exposed to many for the first time a reality that Black Americans have been dealing with for much too long. That reality is that Black lives continue to be systematically choked by persistent patterns of anti-Blackness and institutional racism in employment, housing, education, criminal justice, environmental justice, and healthcare. The pain that many feel right now and took to the streets is beyond the killing of George Floyd or the soul-shaking murders of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDaniel, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, or Elijah McClain. It is really the pain of hundreds of years. It is real hurt. It is not some manifestation of structural conditions or just another academic instruction. It's just real, honest, raw pain. And we grieve deeply for all that's been lost to our country, to our world by the 400 years of limiting opportunities for African Americans and other members of the African diaspora. I think if you do have any sense of transnational solidarity with Africans in the diaspora like I do, and many others do, it can almost be too much to bear. There really are no words for it, really. And it should be no surprise that when 400 years of oppression comes out, it's not expressed in a whisper. In Yoruban culture, there is a person called an Are, and they're often conceptualized or seen as a permanent stranger. And this permanent stranger is always on the move, always discovering and exploring new territories, transforming themselves, ever in pursuit of their ori, or their inner spiritual head, their personal destiny. As they make their life journeys into relatively unfamiliar territories, searching for inspiration and illumination, they shape and are shaped by, right, the social, religious, and intellectual visions with whom they interact. And I share this quote because I really identify with it, not because it just speaks to my sense of identity as a perpetual border crosser as a young person, but also as an anthropologist and an international education professional. Now, as a graduate student, I spent a total of about 12 months across the span of a year, excuse me. As a graduate student, I spent a total of about 12 months across the span of several years conducting ethnographic and applied research in the Dominican Republic. Much of that focused on coral reef ecosystems, climate change, and environmental justice on the north coast of the country near the Haitian border. As I was doing research for this important project, I examined a number of texts, and I came across a really small footnote in one book that referenced descendants of African Americans who lived on the Samana Peninsula. It was on the opposite side, as we'll see here on the map that's on the slide. Samana is located on the opposite end of the country's North Shore, where I've been working again in fishing and farming communities. The Samana Peninsula itself is named after the indigenous cacique, Samana, spelled with an X, who fought against Spanish colonization. The Samana Peninsula also importantly was the last stop, right, was the place of the last stop that Christopher Columbus made on his first mistaken journey to the Americas. Partly reflective of the immediate resistance that he encountered from the indigenous population, he renamed the area Golfo de las Flechas, or Bay of Arrows. Now, African Americans from Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York began arriving on the peninsula in the early 1820s as part of a cautiously voluntary migration to the hemisphere's first Black independent nation, Haiti. In 1790, a massive slave rebellion had dismantled the jewel of French colonialism in the Caribbean and sent shockwaves through the Americas and Europe. As you might imagine, Southern planners in the United States were especially concerned about the shining and seismic example of Haiti. But after the revolution, they moved and began to colonize the eastern 2/3 of the island and took control again of the entire island. But let me back up for a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. I just want to emphasize that the cultural incubator of the Haitian rebellion, the Haitian slave rebellion, were actually religious or spiritual gatherings that were infused with Congolese spiritual beliefs and practices, including drumming and dance, that often culminated in spirit possession. Now, of course, there had to be logistical war planning, and this was, in fact, a war for freedom. But in their spiritual practices, enslaved Africans from diverse cultures could blend cosmologies and rituals, could feel and see enough of the flash of the spirit, right, to fuel a sense of community, to feel supernatural joy, healing, and courage. African-American spirituality, my point is, right, offered the enslaved the connective tissue for solidarity. Culture was their weapon for liberation. And some of the historical literature suggests that many of the enslaved who mobilized believed that specially prepared medicines and amulets would prevent them from dying, would protect them from the bullets of the French, while others believed if they were killed while rebelling, that their souls would return to Africa. Now, a few decades after the revolution, the Haitian government had control over the entire island of Hispaniola. And it was during this time that they sent emissaries to the United States to begin recruiting immigrants among freed Blacks in the North. Among their stops was the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, founded by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And it was among the first independent Black churches established in the United States. By 1824, the AME Church under Richard Allen and Jones was a driving force behind Black immigration, the Black immigration movement to Haiti. The immigration scheme was also importantly evolving simultaneously as the American Colonization Society, that included many of our founding fathers, was working to encourage and support Black immigration to Liberia. Allen and Jones did not support or encourage immigration to Liberia. They were among those who saw through this plan for what it was, a plan for ethnic cleansing and protecting the Southern slave system. They supported the immigration movement to Haiti, no doubt, partly because of its association, right, with the culture and political meanings of Haiti and the Black political imagination and all that it stirred. In total, about 6,000 African Americans eventually settled across Haiti in what would eventually become the Dominican Republic. And the largest demographic settled in the Samana Peninsula, where I conducted my dissertation research. Now, in 1870, interesting, the same year that President Grant sent in federal troops to curtail lynching and other forms of racist terrorism in South Carolina, he sent Frederick Douglass to Samana as part of a U.S. Commission of Inquiry into annexing the Dominican Republic. If you have more interest, you can find some of his really insightful observations in this report. But interestingly, serving as a reminder is exactly what pushed even free Blacks to leave the United States. As Douglass traveled to and from the Dominican Republic on a US ship, I believe it was the Tennessee, he was not even allowed to sit in the ship's main dining room with the white representatives and delegates who were part of the investigation. Now today, there is still an AME church in Samana, in the town of Samana, and a number of smaller satellite AME churches right in rural areas surrounding the main town. There you find, the descendants of the original African-American immigrants. Most of the older generation remain trilingual, speaking English patois, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. And on some Sundays, you can hear AME hymns coming out of the church, like "Give Me That Old Time Religion," still being sung in English. And on some evenings, neighborhoods are filled with the morning songs associated with all-night wakes for the dead. More recently, this culture, their unique culture, has been commodified as a means to attract tourists to the Salmon Peninsula, which is evolving into quite the pimper's paradise. Now, those who participate in this Black nationalist movement did not find the promised land they had hoped for, but they did escape American racism, and they sustained culturally vibrant communities with a decent standard of living for the time. And there must have been something, I think, quite liberating, quite healing, right, about just trying, right, to put a Pan-African or transnational liberatory vision to reality. Now, eventually, these Dominican communities would be enveloped by the anti-Blackness of the Dominican Republic and experience new forms of bias and discrimination and marginalization, though never as intense as what has been experienced by Haitians in the Dominican Republic. A few weeks ago, I stumbled across an NPR broadcast entitled "The Bitter Work Behind Sugar." And in that podcast, reporters visited and interviewed Haitian migrants in the Dominican Republic who live in the work camps called bateys. And they are part of and they're working in a vast sugarcane plantation owned by the Central Romano Corporation. Now, this company is the Dominican Republic's largest private employer, but workers have no access to government pensions. And so often, as we learned in this report, they're forced to work in the fields into their 80s for as little as $3 a day. And although Central Romana, this sugarcane business corporation, generates an estimated $1.5 billion in profits a year, most of the workers are so poor they can't even afford doctor's visits. And cane cutters say that most must go into deep debt just to survive, leaving them trapped, right, in the bateys. Human trafficking and child labor continue to persist as major human rights abuses in this area as well. After listening to this broadcast, I was really overwhelmed with grief, reflecting on how little had changed for Haitians working in the Dominican Republic's sugar industry since I first began visiting the island 25 years ago. And at that time, I wrote a little small op-ed for a local newspaper in Ann Arbor, highlighting that the United Nations Anti-Slavery Society had warned the world that the treatment of Haitians in the Dominican Republic was a version of modern-day slavery. Sadly, this still seems to be the case today and deserves our attention. And equally disappointing is the fact that our own US immigration and refugee policy has not changed much over the last 25 years. Despite catastrophic natural disasters that have killed hundreds of thousands of Haitians, and despite really the reality of a failed state that cannot protect people from everyday violence of gangs and other forms of political violence, our government refuses to grant Haitians refugee status. And instead, as we see here in this image, rounds them up like escaped slaves and sends them back to Haiti. As James Baldwin said, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. And here you see on the screen a quote from Eduardo Galeano, which is a reference to the deeper, again, history within the Dominican Republic of trying to exercise the nation of its Blackness. And Haitians, of course, felt the full brunt of that. Clearly, as we see reflected in this picture, and in the quote as well from Galeano, very, very old patterns of exploitation by dispossession of land, labor, resources, and rights persist. But importantly, right, resistance against racism, as well as the continued expansion of racialized capitalism, has interacted to create mutations of racism that in turn have generated new forms of dispossession, profiteering, and importantly, demanded new types of resistance. What we find is that there are fierce racialized struggles for land and resources, often linked to the genocidal practices of state governments, are major features of both indigenous and African diaspora populations throughout Latin America. For example, Afro-Colombians, For example, Afro-Colombians who have historically occupied land rich in timber, gold, and farming potential and biodiversity on the Pacific coast, have mobilized with some success to push back against being violently displaced, right, from their natural resource rich area by national and international economic interests. Across the border in Ecuador is one of the most impoverished regions in the country. And it's home to one of the country's 3 distinct Afro-Ecuadorian communities, each of which has its own unique origin story. I had a chance to visit these communities while I was serving as executive director of the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs. It has supported a longstanding program in Ecuador. Now, like their Afro-Colombian neighbors, their coastal ecosystem is rich in natural resources and biodiversity. The government of Ecuador, motivated by the possibility of earning high levels of foreign exchange, decided to support the development of an export-oriented shrimp farming industry along the coast. Public land along the Pacific coast was allocated freely or at a very low cost to the shrimp farming industry, which reaped massive profits as Ecuador became Latin America's largest exporter of shrimp. The state shrimp farming promotion was carried out with complete disregard for the traditional rights and historical practices of this large population of Afro-Ecuadorian subsistence farmers and fishermen. As a result, the industry experienced unfettered expansion along the Ecuadorian coast, which in turn led to massive mangrove depletion and depletion of some of the world's oldest mangrove forests. And along the way, Afro-Ecuadorians were losing some of their traditional practices and the traditional uses of the mangrove ecosystem. However, these communities mobilized to successfully stop the expansion of the shrimp industry, seeing themselves as guardians of these ancient mangroves. Working with the support of several international climate justice groups, they pressed hard. They worked through political manipulations. They worked through death threats to get their region declared an ecological reserve in order to preserve its biodiversity. And today, members of the community now work in the park as park rangers and educators. For me, this is a triumphant story that fills me with hope. David took on Goliath and actually won with a little transnational solidarity. I see their story as a very powerful example of healing justice that both promotes planetary health and environmental justice for Afro-Ecuadorian communities. Now, as a result of similar activities and mobilizations in the past 2 decades, many Central American and Latin American nations, including Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Nicaragua, have passed legislation recognizing these multicultural populations have been invisible culturally and politically. And in some instances, they've actually granted them constitutional rights and land titles. For example, the government of Nicaragua granted semi-autonomous political status to the eastern region of their country, where they have a very large indigenous and African diaspora population. I had a chance to visit this region leading a learning abroad program as a faculty member at DePaul University. A really culturally complex and rich community. And here in this eastern region, indigenous people work with African diaspora folks to establish and found the autonomous university of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. And at its core mission, right, is providing free education, right, that will help develop and cultivate the next generations of the leaders so they can really fully assume, right, leadership and control over the political and economic development of their region. Now, these struggles across Central and South America against racism have really been impacted, right, by the anti-racist struggles in the United States and South Africa. And what we see emerging too, right, is a greater connectivity among African diaspora populations in terms of their scope, the levels of activity, and the level of transnational, again, communication and collaboration. For example, Huracan, the University of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua that I just mentioned, as early as the 90s, was inviting community college students and their families down to the university so they can learn more about their efforts there, and both communities could share and learn from each other as they discuss similarities in their lived experiences and can learn more from each other's political strategies. Clearly, contemporary global communication technologies have created new possibilities for this sort of transnational solidarity and resistance. Black popular culture, of course, has also played a very strategic, though controversial role in creating and sustaining an African diaspora identity, the sense of belonging to a larger African diaspora. And importantly, the distribution and adoption of popular cultural forms such as hip hop, and the incorporation and exchange of other musical forms, right, has provided mediums for diasporic communication, building of community, and sometimes political mobilization. Now, the development of these organizations and movements has been especially transformative in Latin America, where ideologies that glorified racial mixture, which suggested there was no race in the country, but just one race, there was no legal segregation, that had all inhibited racialized movements. But with this encroachment, right, on the traditional cultures and territories of African diaspora populations, again, we're seeing the emergence, right, of racialized movements, which didn't exist prior to this. Now, as we look across the diaspora, including looking here in the United States, clearly there's a tremendous diversity of anti-racist strategies and interventions that are derived in part, right, from the local conditions and histories, but also, right, the divergences, the differences between strategies and interventions, also it's grounded in the very different ideological perspectives among anti-racist activists about the cause, nature, and future of racism, and the most effective means of confronting it. There are a wide array of different coalitional activities taking place, and across the diaspora, communities are addressing police harassment, racist violence, social services, and voting rights, as well as immigration and refugee rights. These projects have utilized a range of strategies, policies, and practices, including individual racist interventions, public policy demands, as well as legislative reforms, such as affirmative action or reparations, or granting of land rights. Now, I want to kind of slowly move toward closure in my presentation by highlighting two movements or approaches that I think really resonate with me. So I'm going to take a little circuitous route to get there. As Mary Jo mentioned in my introduction, I work at the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation. I was hired as their very first DEI director about 4 months ago. For over 70 years, the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation has been offering hope and healing to those struggling with addiction to alcohol and other drugs. Now, the foundation pursues this mission through, I think, a compelling ecosystem approach that includes direct residential and outpatient treatment, research produced by their Butler Center, political advocacy, publishing, and education through its Graduate School of Addiction Studies. The work of our foundation, I think, is more important than ever, especially for our BIPOC communities. Nationwide, the CDC estimates more than 92,000 Americans died of overdoses in the 12 months ending in November 2020. This is the highest number ever recorded, and it represents a 30% increase over the 2019. And it represents over 20,000 more dead bodies. It should not be surprising that the stressors of systemic racism and persistent incidents of police brutality and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BIPOC communities has taken a severe toll on the mental health in our communities. This disruptive convergence has intensified the addiction crisis and overdose epidemic, where we see huge disparities. Researchers at UCLA say the largest increase in drug overdoses in 2020 was among Black people, with a spike of more than 50%. Here in Minnesota, the Department of Health says African Americans are almost twice as likely to die of drug overdose than whites. And American Indians are 7 times more likely to die of drug overdoses than whites. Fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine are the leading causes of accidental drug deaths in these communities. And this is important information to share. Not only because of the extent of the crisis, but also the ways in which some of our perceptions actually block an understanding of the scope and magnitude of the problem, right? The portrait of the opioid epidemic that swept across our nation has long been painted as one of rural-wide affliction, but the demographics have actually been shifting for years as deaths are surging in Black and Indigenous communities. One of the reasons I jumped at the opportunity to work for the foundation is that I think it's positioned at one of the important front lines in our effort to advance health equity and healing justice. And more broadly, believe the organization is doing very important work to advance the healing of our nation. You know, I cannot help but see the opioid epidemic, right, as a sign of a deeper spiritual and cultural crisis in our society, where BIPOC communities really are just the canaries in the coal mine. Now, what you see reflected here on the next slide was my first chance to represent the foundation in the broader public. And it came just a few weeks after my start at the foundation. I was asked by Dr. Joseph Lee, our new president and CEO, and importantly, our first CEO of color and the first doctor that served as CEO and president of our organization. He had invited me to be a part of this Fox 9 television interview. After wrapping up with Dr. Lee, Tim Boltz engaged me in some nice friendly banter back and forth as we moved locations and got lights and mics and everything set up. And after a confirmation that I was ready, Tim suddenly switched his tone. It wasn't quite so friendly anymore. And he turned to that hard driving journalistic voice and asked me, does Hazleton Betty Ford have a diversity problem? I tried to keep my poker face. Despite my surprise by the first question, though I might not have been surprised, and I quickly tried to reframe the deficit orientation of this question to suggest that we really had a tremendous opportunity to more fully live our mission through deepening our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that, of course, is true, but I think in some ways I skirted his answer, or excuse me, skirted his question a bit and didn't offer a direct response. And in hindsight, I wish I could have told Tim this. You know, if we've learned anything over the last 19 months, it's that America still has a so-called diversity problem, better understood as an equity and racial justice problem. That's not even to mention, right, gender issues, issues for members of our LGBTQ plus community, that we still have an open wound that we've really failed to reckon with and repair. And as a result, we've really been hindered in our efforts to build a more genuine multicultural democracy. And not surprisingly, Tim, right, as part of that larger society, the Hazleton Betty Ford Foundation is not immune from the patterns of pain, patterns and pain of racism, sexism, homophobia, and other types of individual and systemic bias and discrimination that are manifest in our largest society. And as a result, we have very urgent work to do. Urgent work to do to create a more inclusive culture for our BIPOC, women, LGBTQ plus staff. We have important work to do to diversify our workforce. We continue to have important work to do to reach more diverse individuals, payments, communities with our mission of offering hope and healing. We have crucial work to do around expanding our outreach and collaboration with more diverse roster community partners like Turning Point, an Afrocentric community-based organization in North Minneapolis, been serving the African American community for almost 40 years. George Floyd actually visited Turning Point as he was trying to get his life together and advance his own personal healing. And on that note of healing, as a foundation, we have important healing work to do as an organization. You know, this is the humbling admission that we are sharing, and we want to share our commitment, right, to act intelligently and courageously for inclusive excellence, for health equity and healing justice. This is some of what I wish I could have shared with Tim and what I share with you today. What I want to share next is a quote from Jessica Haney, who's has been a co-chair of Hazleton Betty Ford's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. She's an addiction program manager in our Newburgh, Oregon location. And Jessica's quote can be found on our Hazleton Betty Ford website. She said, "The future of this institute, the future of our organization, the healing we do in the community heavily relies on our ability to heal our own organization." I think over the last 4 months, I've been struck by the parallels between the mission of our foundation and the work of advancing racial justice in the broader society and DEI within our organizations. In some ways, our racial justice work is about helping wean Americans of their addiction to racism and anti-Blackness. But disrupting the addiction, as I've been reminded recently, is only the beginning of healing. It just really offers us a small dose of hope. I've come to feel the same way about achieving racial justice and building more equity-minded and inclusive organizations. Policy solutions are necessary, right? They're often designed to fix racial inequality, and they might offer relief, but they don't necessarily offer us healing. So many of our DEI trainings may offer new learnings, may change hearts and minds, but more often than not, I'm not sure they do change hearts and minds, and they often generate more resistance and frustration, and they rarely offer us healing. As the old saying goes, only a fool will continue to do the same thing and expect different results. I really believe our nation is in a particular historical moment that calls us in our organization to have a more expansive approach to advancing racial justice in the United States. Aligned with the resonant call of American Indian and African American leaders such as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Wazi Yatuan, Diane Wilson, Brian Stevenson, Reverend William Barber, and Reverend Angel Kyoto, I believe our nation needs to establish a truth and reconciliation process. My position is grounded in the assumption that we cannot have a healed society, we cannot have whole organizations, we cannot have reconciliation, we cannot have racial justice if we do not engage in a deep and authentic process of reckoning and repair in relation to our nation's past. As a colonial settler society built on hundreds of years of patriarchal white supremacy, colonization, slavery, genocide, and ecocide. In short, I don't believe we can emerge from something we haven't really owned and recognized. The history of this country has not been honestly spoken, and many people of all races don't know that true history. And we can see in the pushback against critical race theory how much fear there still seems to be in our country really honestly talking about and interrogating its history. Now, equal numbers in our society, I think, have a very limited understanding of the current violence and trauma that is part and parcel, right, of racialized capitalism, right, as a process of political and economic nation. Because of this, I feel like we still have a lot of unattended trauma, mistrust, racial tension, ignorance, resentment, and violence in our society. Now, as many of you know, many countries have pursued national reconciliation. New Zealand, Northern Ireland, places I've been and been inspired by, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and of course, South Africa. These reconciliations have taken many forms, but they all included the goals of addressing historical trauma and a commitment to a more just and equitable future. I believe truth and reconciliation gives us a space and a process to bear witness to the transgenerational cultural illness of white supremacy. Truth and reconciliation ask us to imagine what it looks like to truly sit with the pain caused by racism in our spirit, in our culture, and in our body. Truth and reconciliation demands that we step into the healing circle and ask, how do we restore our humanity? How do we transform ourselves? How do we heal ourselves and our world? I think it pushes us, truth and reconciliation, to overstand, as my Jamaican brothers and sisters say, how the system of racism has traumatized us all, Black and white, brown, indigenous. And it pushes us to think about what we need to heal both individually and collectively. I think the point that deserves special emphasis is that reconciliation is healing is more than apologies, it's more than land acknowledgements. Reconciliation requires both personal, cultural, and institutional transformation in our attitudes, our orientations, and behaviors. It requires public spaces to grieve and art and memorials that fight against historical amnesia and invisibility. And here I applaud the work of Brian Stevenson, right, in establishing the Equal Justice Initiative's memorial to lynching in Alabama, or the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. It's important sites of healing and learning and grieving. Now, many people believe that reconciliation and repair requires reparations. In the context of the United States, truth and reconciliation reparations at the national level might be unrealistic. But I think it's exciting to see that some cities like Evanston, Illinois, Burlington, Vermont, are already exploring and trying to build frameworks for possible reparation policies. Regardless, I believe that reconciliation can begin to help us accomplish some of the same purposes in communities and organizations. And from there, we can expand it to the national level, perhaps. And sometimes I believe that perhaps starting this truth and reconciliation process at the grassroots level, at the organization level, may actually offer us greater potential for advancing healing than traditional top-down approaches. Now, many will find this path challenging, because it means we have to imagine a way of being that's perhaps a little bit different. It pushes us to move beyond our anger, our woundedness, and our despair. We might feel that healing means forgetting, and that we have been hurt, oppressed, and that there's an oppressor who should be and must be held accountable for their violence. Or perhaps we think healing really means weakness. But I think the thing I want to emphasize is that our pain, our suffering, it's going to be there until it's met and seen for what it is. It's not going to go anywhere. Protests, policy reform, electoral victories don't offer complete healing. We cannot have a healed society. We cannot have change. We cannot have justice if we don't reclaim and repair American culture, diverse cultural communities, and our bodies. Our healing really cannot wait, right, until systems of oppression are dismantled or defunded or just come undone. And even if all that were to happen, I still don't think there's any guarantee of the sort of healing that we need at the societal or individual level. Now, I'm aware that this kind of new initiative doesn't really offer us the instant gratification of other racial justice and efforts. However, I believe that making this long-term investment in love, healing, truth, and reconciliation really holds the most promise for us for deeper transformational justice, both at the organizational and national levels. Now, this truth and reconciliation work is already being done at a grassroots level. And here I'll pause and just pull up one more slide here. I think part of what I've been trying to capture, what I communicate, is really captured, in these slides. Probably what we see on the right side of the slide is Sean Fields is a local artist. He's doing beautiful work. This is his representation of the lynching that took place in Duluth. Part of what the other piece of the slide represents, right, is really the core message I was trying to convey just now, which is we repeat what we don't repair. We've got important repair work to do at many different levels. Even here close to home, part of what you see here is an image from the 1923 University of Minnesota Homecoming Parade. This is a KKK float. This is just one example, right, of some of the stories that we have to uncover, a beginning point for some of our repair work. But one of the driving forces between some of the expansion of truth and reconciliation work is the Kellogg Foundation. They've been driving this work in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and they've been a leading support financially of the extensive work being done by the Association of American Colleges and Universities. They've initiated a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative, and it's established over 70 what they call TRHT campus centers around the country. They envision their work as a national and community-based initiative that's going to address the historical and contemporary impacts of race and racism within our communities. Each Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center will prioritize expansive, community-based healing activities that seek to change collective community narratives and broaden our understanding of our diverse experiences and how we can begin to heal individually and collectively. Locally here, Hamline University is one of these campus centers. And I think the University of Minnesota should feel proud that within our system, the University of Minnesota Rochester is among the institutions, thanks to the support of Chancellor Lori Carroll and many others at that institution, that's pursuing this approach as another layer of their DEI and public engagement efforts. Now, at the center of these efforts is storytelling. Let me return to my youth soccer coach and Holocaust survivor, Michael Vogel. His son once told me that his father wouldn't talk about the terror he experienced in Auschwitz. And it wasn't until he actually met another survivor that he found the courage to share his story. I think what this example offers us is a reminder that we can find strength and healing in sharing our stories, uncovering the stories of our local geographies, again, like the KK's presence at the University of Minnesota's homecoming, like the Duluth lynching, seen in Sean Phillips' artistic image. Besides centering storytelling, one of the key features of this approach versus traditional approaches to diversity training is that those entering the healing circles are asked to bring a radical ethic of love, to bring grace and empathy to the discussions, and that holds those who've been infected by racism in the light of their humanity. They're not to be canceled. They're not to be shamed and blamed. That our approach is one of distinguishing disease, the disease of white supremacy, right from the actual host. I will be pushing our foundation to embrace truth and reconciliation as another important layer of our work to create a more equity-minded and inclusive organization with a more expansive reach, right, in our mission to offer hope and healing. And I believe it is necessary healing work we must all do if we're going to be successful in our larger mission. I think the central question we need to be asking ourselves in all of our institutions is how can we responsibly and generatively lead on a permanent basis with truth and reconciliation as core ethics, embodied in all facets of how we operationalize our missions and our visions. And here I move toward conclusion. I think over the last 18 months, we've all heard a lot about self-care. We've all been encouraged appropriately to focus on our self-care as we move through the severe disruptions caused by the pandemic, racial violence, and the assault on our democracy. And I believe this is a really important shift in our work cultures and cultural communities, especially our BIPOC communities. Though I do think we need to be very critical as we listen and we think about what self-care looks like and how we pursue it. I think we need to push back against any notion that it's only the responsibility of individuals to support their self-care. As we all know, our institutions, our organizations, our employers, our workplaces often, right, push us so hard and drive us so hard that it creates the need for extra self-care. And as people of color within these organizations, right, we have a higher need sometimes for self-care as well. So I think it's incumbent upon institutions, not just individuals, right, to explore and offer resources for self-care, to offer something beyond narrative motivation. Now, I think some of the more exciting and transformative racial justice work that's being done in our country right now is being done at the intersection of personal, organizational, and social transformation. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I got a little, looks like one of my slides might have disappeared, but I'm going to keep rolling here. So I think there's really exciting work going on right at this intersection of individual and societal healing. Therapists like Risma Menachem right here in Minnesota are pushing us to examine the damage caused by racism in America from the perspective of trauma and a body-centered psychology. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, Menachem argues that more transformative justice will be elusive until Americans really learn to heal the generational wounds of white supremacy, which he reminds us, right, pulling from the somatic literature, psychology literature, brain science, is deeply embedded in all of our bodies. And Menachem emphasizes that racial trauma just doesn't impact people of color, but white Americans, he suggests, also suffer from secondary trauma. And as he does, and this is reflected in his work, so do Blue Americans, our police. Now, Menachem, like the author and Dharma practitioner, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, they're illuminating a new way for us, a new pathway toward liberation that's grounded in a body-centered understanding of white supremacy and how it's literally, right, embodied in our blood and nervous system. They offer us visions of a healing process, right, based on the latest neuroscience and somatic healing methods, in addition to incisive cultural criticism. In the book, Radical Dharma, co-authors Williams, Lama Rod Owens, and Dr. Jasmine Sedula, they call us to work at this intersection of personal and social liberation, arguing that the two are intimately connected, dialectically related. That when we pursue this path of radical Dharma that they're mapping for us, that this is not a path of solely inward-looking liberation, of meditation, staring at our navels, nor is it just about, right, advancing social liberation. But part of what they're working to do, what we see emerging as sort of this third space, that in many ways it still is taking shape in terms of what its form might be. And knowing that within this, right, that every individual has their own pathway, right, to individual and collective healing. Reverend Kyoto Williams and others who are authors, contributors to Radical Dharma are really pushing BIPOC folks to explore the Dharmic traditions of meditation and yoga. They encourage us to engage in reflective and contemplative practices that really turn our attention toward inward healing. They remind us, like Menachem, right, that unattended trauma is going to prevent us from fully living and exhibiting our own agency. It will prevent us from fully inhabiting our bodies and from healing our communities. Trauma, they say, keeps us as individuals and a society in that sunken place that is so brilliantly illuminated in Jordan Peele's film, Get Out. They write, and here you see it on the slide, healing is being situated in love. Healing is not just the courage to love, but to be loved. It's the courage to want to be happy, not just for others, but for ourselves as well. It is interrogating our bodies as an artifact of the accumulated traumas and doing the work of processing that trauma by developing the capacity to notice and be with our brain. We must address the pain and discomfort that has been habitually avoided. I believe healing involves more, right? Partly, I believe healing means discovering that we are more than our wounds and our traumas. And while healing will involve experiencing moments of overwhelming pain and grief, uncertainty and messiness, I believe as we confront our individual and collective trauma, that we will uncover expansive reserves of strength and power that we don't even know exist within us. I think radical Dharma offers us the chance to equip ourselves intellectually, politically, and importantly, spiritually and physically for the important work of reclaiming our humanity and our freedom. All of us, not just African Americans, will need to grapple with this inherited pain of our settler colonial history for a long time if we are truly to make sense of it and heal. I think it's this exact point which Baldwin's articulating in this quote from his important piece, The Fire Next Time. He writes, the only thing white people have that Black people need or should want is power, and no one holds power forever. And I repeat, the price of liberation of the white people is the liberation of Blacks, total liberation in the cities and the towns before the law and in the mind. African Americans have gifted the United States, I believe, a cultural, ethical, and political inheritance that highlights a path toward racial justice, collective healing, and greater human freedom. Radical Dharma is just one of the latest of these gifts for us to explore. I close with this next slide. As you remember, some of my research focused on African Americans, freed African Americans who left the United States in the 1820s for Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It was during this period that that Henry Berry, a member of the Virginia House of Representatives, made the following statement. We have as far as possible closed every avenue by which light may enter the slave's mind. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work will be complete. Then they would be on the level of the beast of the fields, and then we would be safe. Clearly, despite 400 years of oppression, African Americans and members of the African diaspora have not lost our ability to see the light. And over the last 18 months, I know it's been hard for many of us to see that light, but Amanda Gorham's stellar poem at the inauguration of President Biden reminded us all, right, that we still have our capacity to see the light, that the light is stronger than the shade. Now, the Black Freedom Movement teaches us that the struggle for transformative justice has always generated some backlash, but it also teaches us that if we can find the strength to love, the strength to be loved, if we can find the courage to engage in the soul-growing work of healing justice, we can recover from spiritual death, moral bankruptcy, and racialized oppression. As one of my intellectual and political heroes said near the last days of her life, and I'm talking about Grace Lee Boggs, she says, hey, these are times to grow our souls. You know, it is my sincere hope that my feeble storytelling this afternoon has made some small but hopefully meaningful contribution to our ongoing and important conversations and critical efforts to advance racial justice, healing, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Well, I have to say thank you to you, Andrew, for this very deep and profound immersion. I really feel like I have been in a class and experience that has exposed me to history, sociology, anthropology, political science, policy, environmental science, cultural and racial oppression. I mean, you have really covered an incredibly wide expanse. And we are really deeply grateful for all of the information that you've brought to us today. There are so many questions that have come in that I'm going to just dive into the questions. The first one, we all need to take responsibility for our past and work to right wrongs. How can allies also support the hard work that needs to happen within the Black community itself? I see the anguish of Black mothers losing their babies to gun violence at the hands of kids without role models and with limited vision for their life. Viewing the Black community as helpless victims of history, as some do, isn't helpful. What can allies do to best support the Black community as it works to lift itself up and heal?
No, thank you, Mary Jo, for sharing, what is a very important question. I'm not sure we even have time in the 20 minutes we have left to offer a kind of thorough response to such an important question, deserves. And I appreciate this kind of spirit of solidarity that's expressed in the question as well. I think, among the things that I would recommend, is partly for folks to reflect on where they're at in their own learning and understanding of these issues. I know that, we have a tendency as to want to, again, as I said earlier, move toward really quick solutions, and we want to step in and we want to help. But I think it's most important for allies, right, to spend some time in self-reflection, to do an honest self-reflection on where they're at in their understanding of these issues, and to work hard, right, to educate themselves around the issues that are most salient, right, and impacting our African American community. I think among some of the most important things that white allies can do, of course, is to challenge each other as well. That I think, I love the quote that says, what we in some ways permit, we promote. I think we all see every day in our lives, in our workplaces, right? We see microaggressions and macroaggressions happening. And I think it's, one among the things that I think white allies can do is to try to move from being bystanders to upstanders, to really be those interrupters, disruptors, to stand in solidarity, to interrupt these moments where there's an effort to do racial bonding around whiteness or white privilege. So I think moving from bystander to upstander, and when Black folks aren't around, when Latinx folks and Indigenous people aren't around looking, I think is important. And I think, the other piece, and we've been grappling with this some at Hazelton Betty Ford, is for my white brothers and sisters to really think about their levels, their privilege, and to think about how they can leverage that privilege, their racial privilege, their economic privilege, their gender privilege, right? To both challenge patterns of bias and discrimination within their communities, within their organizations, and how can they leverage that privilege as well, right? To help support, the social movements within the Black community, whether it be through offering kind of infrastructure support, logistical support, or even financial support. And I would just maybe close by saying among the most important things sometimes that white allies can do is just to listen. And as we listen, sometimes we hear things, we feel things that make us very uncomfortable. And I think it's in those moments where it's really incumbent upon white allies to listen to themselves, to feel that discomfort, and to ask themselves what it can teach them, right, about their understanding of their issue and their orientation toward diverse communities and the larger social justice work that's out in front of us.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. What we permit, we promote. Very, very powerful. Someone else writes, there's quite a bit of diversity within the Black community itself. Do you think that the past year and a half has brought these different groups within the Black community closer together, or is there more friction and divisiveness? I'm specifically referring to immigrant communities and those whose ancestors have been Americans for generations.
Oh, another really important and complex question. Without having real evidence speak to. All that I say with tremendous caution, and should be heard with tremendous skepticism. But I do believe, certainly, and I think in some ways, if I would have had more time, I would have elaborated on how I believe, in particular, the Black Lives Matters movement, right, has not just remained a localized movement. And in fact, right, I think it has helped to create and generate a greater sense of Pan-African or transnational solidarity among members of the African diaspora across the Americas and Europe and in Africa as well. And we see that in different ways, and we see it locally too. Our colleague or our participant asked about, immigrant populations, how do they fit into the mix? I mean, part of what we see now, and I think partly it's because of the impact of Black Lives Matter, is that Afro-Latinos in the United States, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are increasingly beginning to see themselves, right, as part of this diaspora and really pushing back against the notion of mestizaje, or that they're somehow not members of the African diaspora. And so I see this movement, or in some ways, right, being, and it's really kind of beginning to pull in other diverse communities. The reality is that, the Black community has never been a monolithic community in terms of our cultural ways of being, our social values, and our political values. And I think it's important that as we look at, the massive, the large scale protests, that we also recognize, right, there are large swaths of the Black community that weren't a part of that. It doesn't mean they're not in solidarity, but for different reasons, just really weren't out on the streets as well. But I think there is a kind of a new spirit of solidarity that's been fueled and sparked by the Black Lives Matters movement, and the increasing intensity of this feeling of being under assault. I think in that context, it's been easier to kind of identify what we share in common than to focus on some of our cultural differences, and in some ways our competing political and economic interests. But still, there are still very real and significant fault lines within the Black community and between members of the African diaspora community. And we're often pitted against each other, right, by larger financial, educational, and other sorts of social systems.
So somebody else writes, Andrew, what do you think the impact of this past year and a half has been, the racial reckoning on Black youth? On one hand, I would hope that it would result in hope and a feeling of being seen. On the other hand, it must be incredibly painful. And then the person adds, I hope it nets out more positive than hurtful.
I'm sorry, Mary Jo, could you repeat that?
Now, the question was the impact of the last year and a half, the racial reckoning on Black youth. Mm-hmm. Has it been positive because there's been more awareness, or has the impact been just more deeply painful? And do we even know, I guess, is, the honest question.
Yeah, again, I don't have any real kind of, research-based evidence, to speak intelligently or to offer an intelligent response to the question. I think it's been a double-edged sword. I think part of what I tried to convey in my presentation, that it's actually, through participation in, right, social movements, through participation in these efforts for racial justice, that we are building community and we're finding healing. And so I think, this greater sense of solidarity that folks are experiencing, the sense that in fact our protests are making a difference, even if only temporary, I think has in some ways, right, fueled and strengthened, right, the spirit of young African-American people, that there is hope and that they actually, have the power. If you look at who was out there leading our Black Lives movement, it was often, right, young, queer people of color, young, queer African-Americans. And I think they've had a significant and really kind of palpable impact, right, on our culture, on our society, and the ways we're thinking about policing, and what it means to be Black, and about the Black experience. And so I think, it's had a really positive impact on youth. But then as I shared earlier, if we drill down and look at some of the data on the expansion or the growth of opioid addiction and overdoses, we've clearly been in a moment, right, that has has created tremendous stressors on the mental health of all African Americans, including young people. And so I think this is a really important area for us to look at more closely as we parse out both the positive impacts of the Black Lives Matter movement, these racial justice protests that are even beyond just BLM, that we have to balance that with an understanding of, that the reality is, and that the racial justice movement is pushing back against all have not gone away. But I do think we maybe have a moment, we have a moment of hope. And as Amanda Gorman says, I think we're able to see and feel that light a little bit more now than maybe we could 4 years ago, for sure.
Right. And I love Amanda Gorman's poem that talks about not only seeing the light, but being the light, being the light as well.
Thank you for that, yes.
So somebody else writes, Andrew, I've heard that we may not be able to change a person's mind, but we can change their behavior. Having had hard conversations with family members, I wonder, as an ally, how can we have those hard conversations to change behavior, if not minds?
Whoa, these are great questions. I think, right, I mean, that's part of the pain and challenge of racism, right, in our society, that it often, right, it often is disruptive. It often creates fault lines and tensions and between those who we love most and those who've nurtured and cared for us. As we hear them articulate ideas and engage in behaviors, right, that really run counter to our anti-racist social justice values. And in a familial context, in a community context, I'm not sure, what individuals can do other than set their own boundaries and to convey to family members that I have real boundaries and this sort of behavior is unacceptable. And then until you can move and grow and learn or behave in other ways, I'm going to set some really clear boundaries. I think it's a much easier question to answer, though it doesn't necessarily mean it's easier to operationalize in the context of work. Right, and we've been grappling with this some at the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation. Ultimately, we want to change hearts and minds, but people have a right to believe what they want to believe. We're not looking to kind of create a monolithic culture. We're not looking to impose a PC culture, but we do have very clear guidelines and standards, right, for ethical behavior, professional behavior, and for the sort of behavior we need to create an inclusive work environment. And that's when it's incumbent upon everyone in their workplace as individuals, again, to be disruptors, not just to be bystanders. It's where it's important for organizations to have really clear expectations and guidelines. And again, it's back to my point, Mary Jo, that we promote what we permit. And I think within organizations, we just have to develop systems of accountability. And we have to make sure that we are working those systems of accountability in order to diminish those behaviors, right, which harm others, which dehumanize others, and really diminish their capacity to be full contributors, right, to the life of an organization.
So Andrew, somebody else writes, and you talked about the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation and that you're working with the foundation to try to also advance change. And this person writes, as a former employee at the Hazelton Betty Ford Center, and of my 3 years there, the kitchen staff was 99% African American, and there were only 2 African American men on staff as counselors and coaches. I also realized that the center is unaffordable to the average African American family. In your role, what are you going to be able to do to ensure that a youth or family member from North Minneapolis has access to premium chemical dependency counseling?
Yes, no, that's an important question. And, I first want to echo, the very courageous admission of our new CEO, Dr. Joseph Lee. And he believes our starting point in answering questions like this is that we need to have the courage to own our past, that we have not served African American communities and other communities of color well, nor have we advocated for them as fully and strongly as we should have historically. But we're now committed to trying to get it right. Again, part of what I tried to map out and some of what I shared is that we know that we can move in this direction only by creating a more diverse workforce. And that diversity has to be represented across the organization and not just right in facilities and in the kitchen. I'd say a couple other points though too. And I think there's been a little bit of a lag in the understanding of the foundation and the ways in which who we're serving has changed. It's not to say we aren't still primarily serving white Americans, but you know, the Affordable Care Act was a real game changer for the foundation. And that has forced, you know, insurance companies to offer support, right, for treatment for substance use disorders. That has really allowed us to broaden our banner and to serve a much more diverse, right, portion of the American population than we've served historically. We've had that reputation, right, for being the place where the rich and famous, you know, go for treatment. But, you know, since the passage of Obamacare, there's been a real shift in who we're able to serve. And we continue to work and to explore how we might be able to offer support, right, for those who don't have insurance. And I'd say a couple other points. So part of it is about, you know, outreach. It's about doing the reckoning repair work. There's a financial orientation we need to develop and bring to the work. But we know even if we're accessible, right, if we don't have counselors who look more like the folks we want to serve, if they're not receiving culture responsive care, that we're not going to have success in serving a broader community as well. And I'd say too, we have to be humble and honest and know that we can't do this alone. And that's part of why I'm very excited about our partnership with Turning Point in North Minneapolis. They have intellectual resources. They have a 40-year record of providing quality addiction services to the Black community. We are in touch with them. We're looking to learn from them. We are asking them to come and train our counselors in how we can better serve the African-American community. And at the same time, we're lending our brand, we're lending our advocacy power and strength. We're using our marketing resources, right, to help elevate their voices and their work in the community as we also look to learn from them. So some of this work we want to do ourselves by extending our reach, but we know that partly we can extend our reach and offer quality service to in a more expansive way if we work in partnership with Black communities and Indigenous communities and the Latinx communities. On the Latinx front, we are really expanding and in the early stages of expanding Spanish language programming, both for families and for intensive outpatient treatment as well. So we've still got a lot of work out in front of us. We're really just at the beginning, but I think we've been making some really important strides in serving a more diverse set of patients.
Well, that's incredibly exciting, I think, to hear, Andrew. Somebody else writes, and this will be the last question I ask you. What do you hope for truth and reconciliation work, specifically in relation to the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota? And I asked that question is posed to you, but I know you do have some familiarity with our work since you were at the University of Minnesota.
So what's my hope? And my hope would be that that the Bakken Center, you know, will move to embrace this sort of work. I think, you know, considering that the overall mission of the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing and its kind of core focus on advancing well-being and understanding of how to best support holistic well-being, that it seems incumbent upon, right, the center to embrace, you know, and pursue a process of truth and reconciliation. I think what that looks like within any organization, you know, is likely to be very different. But, you know, I think it's important that we, I would ask the organization to think about moving into this work, to being embracing vulnerability, to move into this knowing you don't have to be a leader, but you can move in as a learner, willing to be broken up by the process. And that there's a commitment to at least explore, to learn from what other campuses are doing, what other units within other campuses are doing, to try to figure out, you know, how the center might manifest, again, the spirit of truth and reconciliation and how it goes about everything from teaching to outreach to partnerships, you know, in the broader community.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. I want to close by reading something to you, Andrew, that came from the chat. And I think it really summarizes what a lot of us are feeling. Somebody wrote, "This has been a beautifully deep and touching presentation. As a white ally, I honestly will take Andrew's presentation, words, and thoughts with me for the rest of my life, and will continue working on understanding and learning to be a more effective ally." The quote, "What we permit, we promote," hits deep. Thank you. So saying thank you really on behalf of everybody that's listening on the webinar today. I also want to acknowledge and thank all of our staff at the Bakken Center who helped make today's webinar possible. We hope that you'll join us for the Leading the Future conference on October 28th, which will co-host with Carlson Executive Education. This is also a free event. It'll be held completely online. And the focus is exploring the intersections of leadership, equity, inclusion, and you. Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to all of you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Thank you, everyone.